Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, for your interest in our conference, which picks up on the theme today of community wealth building. And just by way of information to you all, the conference is being recorded, and the recording will be made available post-conference to those who are interested in it. So thanks then to our speakers. Our keynote, all the way from Denver, Colorado, and taking a very early morning call, is Ted Howard. Ted is president and co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative and will provide our keynote address. So welcome, Ted, and thanks for your support. It's greatly appreciated. So also with us is our good friend and long-time collaborator, Sarah Longlands, Chief Executive at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. Newbie to us, Aine Gawthorpe, Director of Foundational Economy for the Welsh Government, and our old friend, if he has joined us yet, Brendan Murtagh from Queen's University, Belfast. A special word of thanks then also to John Campbell, John's Business and Economics Editor at DTNI, for John's continued support and interest in this work and the work of DTNI. And John will be your facilitator today. Welcome, John, and thank you very much as well. So we've structured the conference and to run in two parts. The first part, looking at community wealth building from an international perspective, particularly focusing on the work of the Democracy Collaborative in support of democratic economy. And then the second part, looking at community wealth building from a UK and a regional perspective as well. And as usual for all our events, we stress informality. And I'd like to encourage you to engage with the presenters and to contribute to the conversation. That's critically important to us. So you can either add your comment or comments into the chat box and or submit questions for our presenters if you want to be brought into the spotlight to ask a question. Your opinion does matter greatly, and it'll help inform how DTNI and our partners Trademark continue to build and move forward on the agenda in support of local economy through a community wealth building approach. And so by way of thanks to you for your support, conference delegates will receive a free copy of The Making of a Democratic Economy, co-authored by Ted and Marjorie Kelly. So this will be available for collection at one of our last independent bookstores in Belfast, No Alibis, and details on how you can collect that book will follow, and we will make a postal option available to those of you, obviously, who will find it inconvenient, to say the least, or difficult to make it to Belfast to pick that up. So briefly then, DTNI is a network body for community development trusts across the region of Northern Ireland. We refer to our members as community anchors, many of whom are 30, 40 years and more in existence and have always been in the lead in terms of delivering social and economic justice. And we've been working over the past 10 months with Trademark, and Sean is here today from Trademark, and awareness raising and engaged in some focused primary research on community wealth building, asking what does this mean for local communities, what is actually being done in this regard already by local communities, and what more is needed to move it forward. So in that, I want to record our thanks then to Sharon, to Bevan and Lorraine at the Department for Communities who have supported us, and for the many stakeholders that have engaged with us along the way. The final research paper on that work, the reports, the advisory papers will be issued publicly in due course. So thanks once again. I hope you will take many positives from today's conversation. And again, please engage with the discussion so we can draw on your knowledge and experience to move the agenda forward.
Welcome everybody to today's conference. I think we were getting the Minister for a moment there. We just missed the top offer, so hopefully we can re-rack that and we can hear from the Minister before the other speakers. Now, I actually first spoke at a Developments Trust event on community wealth building just over 2 years ago. That was a great session at Belfast City Hall where we heard directly from some of the people behind the Preston model. I also remember it very well because I was dying with the cold at that time, and that was back in the days when it was still acceptable to attend in-person events when you were obviously sick. Now, clearly an awful lot has happened since then, and certainly the efforts to advance community wealth building in Northern Ireland have not stood still. And in fact, as Charlie was alluding to there, over the last year, there has been considerable and important work being done by development trusts in partnership with Trademark Belfast to get it onto the agenda of government and policymakers. And just this month, there was a very important step forward as the Communities Minister, Deirdre Hargey, appointed an advisory panel on community wealth building. And we'll be hearing later from one of those panelists, Brendan Murtagh. Just to give you the rundown on how things will go today, we will shortly hopefully go back to that introductory address from the Minister. Then our keynote address will be delivered by Ted Howard, the President and co-founder of the Democracy Collaborative, after which I'll be having a bit of a chat with Ted for 15 or 20 minutes. I would ask you to start sticking any questions you have into the chat, which I can then put to Ted. So just keep those coming as we go. Oh, there's a baby joining us there. Hello there. Our second session, which is titled National Perspective, Regional Action on Community Wealth Building, will feature presentations from Sarah Longlands, Aine Gawthorpe, and the aforementioned Brendan Murtagh, and they will then participate in a panel discussion answering your questions again. So again, keep those coming in the chat. And finally then, again, at the end, we will hear from Charlie from Development Trusts, who will talk about the next steps before we wrap up at about 3:30. So now, hopefully, let's hear from the Minister.
Hi everyone, and thanks to Charlie and John for facilitating today's session and putting together such a meaningful programme. I'm delighted to support this timely exploration on the direction of travel for community wealth building. Today's agenda is exploring the question, what next, by reflecting on our shared ambition in this critical policy space and looking at progress being made in different areas and sharing how the challenges can be overcome by learning from each other and others. I'm sorry I couldn't join you today, but with this being the finishing week of the Assembly, I'm moving legislation in the Chamber. I know there will be lots of meaningful dialogue and lively debate throughout the session. I've been a strong advocate for community wealth building for many years, first as a community activist in South Belfast, then as a councillor and mayor in Belfast City Council, and now as Minister for Communities. The Development Trust, Aine, Trademark and others have been fellow followers on this journey for a number of years, and I've been delighted to be able to work with them to build the case for change that we all recognise is needed. As Minister for Communities, I've made a commitment to grow and scale community wealth building to support economic recovery, and this commitment is embedded in my department's 5-year strategy to build inclusive communities. There's an urgent need to generate new approaches to old problems, and now is the time to shape a socially inclusive recovery which can give back more economic control to communities and contribute to both economic growth and community well-being while tackling poverty and inequality. The current cost of living is hitting many of our communities and shows how vulnerable we are to global shocks. The pandemic exposed the poverty and inequality that already existed in our communities has been exacerbated, and the impacts of Brexit continue to have a focus as well as global events which impact locally. We can't directly control against events like these, but we can buffer the effects through focusing on community empowerment and long-term approaches that build resilience and create more robust, sustainable local economies. I've recently appointed an expert advisory panel on community wealth building, which will bring together a critical mix of local and international expertise and perspectives to shape this agenda and to drive change within the department and across government at an executive level. David Hunter of Access Employment in Larne and Harry Connolly from Fulcha First here in West Belfast both lead community projects with a focus on sustainability. They will bring important insights into grassroots and practical application of community wealth building approaches here and how we can plug some of the gaps on the ground and ensure the communities benefit from these new opportunities. Joe Guinan and Sarah McKinley from the Democracy Collaborative are leading experts in this area and will bring international perspectives and insight into this approach being mobilised elsewhere, including Scotland, where they are both on the Scottish Government Advisory Panel. Dr. Brent Murtagh from Queen's University has a deep understanding of the social economy and will bring important academic perspective, but also a keen knowledge of how government policies have impacted on the ground. The panel will be advising the Department for Communities and the future Minister on the most effective and sustainable approaches to embedding the principles of community wealth building into all relevant departmental investment policy and practice. The panel will challenge the department on a drive for change in key areas such as housing, regeneration, employability, and also consider its practices as a contractor and funder. It will also identify ways that the department can further lead and influence this agenda with key partners, including our arm's length bodies, councils, and across the executive. The panel brings together serious ambition to work with members who share my aim to pave a way for community wealth building approach as a flagship part of the next programme for government. And for community wealth building to work, there has to be a strong foundation of community activism, community enterprise, energy and engagement. And it's the aim of this programme to create new opportunities and ways of addressing inequality and deprivation. Then we really have to consider the readiness of our communities to be involved as key partners. This model can drive changes in government and behaviour of anchor institutions. And alongside this, hugely important to build the capacity of our community anchors, which can advocate and deliver in the local interests of people. The Department for Community already supports key areas of community action through its flagship Neighbourhood Renewal Programme and through its wide range of programmes for regional voluntary and community sector capacity building. The future of these programmes will also have to embed the principles of community wealth building. And I've started this shift already by introducing new fair funding practices within the department that have led to improved salary terms and conditions for all voluntary and community sector workers funded through DFC programmes. Over the past year, I've invested in a programme of work with Trademark and Development Trust to explore what community wealth building means on the ground and how we can build capacity for change. This has led to a wide range of rich conversations and insight, which have been brought together in a series of detailed reports and which will be a great value to the expert panel as they begin their work. People can be given a greater say in decisions that affect them and can have better empowerment to shape their communities in the time ahead. Government can support this by investment, by more progressive procurement, and by more transparent ways of doing business, such as participatory budgeting and co-design of policy and programmes. The Development Trust DTNI and Queen's University have taken forward an in-depth analysis from a large network of key community anchors, exploring the contribution they make to community wealth building and where they may be barriers or the need for additional support. Brenton and Charlie will be outlining some of the key evidence and ideas coming out of this work, and they will be setting out their thoughts on what is next in this area. My department will be sustaining its commitment to the key area of work in the year ahead, providing additional support for capacity building in communities. My department's mission statement, supporting people, building communities, shaping places, very much aligns with the ethos of community wealth building, but embedding this agenda within the department will need a shift in mindset and a willingness to work creatively at our options in the time ahead and to look at new solutions and possibilities. A lot more can be done within the existing framework of rules, but we also need to be willing to consider new regulations and reforms to existing policies. The department has brought Sarah Longlands and her team at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies to work closely with senior officials on a programme of action learning. This programme has brought together key officials delivering in areas such as housing, regeneration, employability and community development, as well as procurement and internal governance. Applying a community wealth building lens to these key policy areas reveals the relevant and potential impact of the agenda at all levels of the department and the role that can be played as both anchor institution and as a policy owner. The department's senior team will be working with the expert advisory panel over the coming months to ensure that this work has a real reach within the department. We live in challenging and complex times, and within a complex world where those most in need are subject to strong and turbulent economic forces. The current economic system does not serve our communities, and we can't ignore the need for meaningful change. Community wealth building is a powerful framework for change and plays into a much wider movement which is pushing for equality, sustainability and investment that will build thriving communities. The approach provides immediate and practical ways to create this real change. And I want to thank everyone for joining the session today, but importantly for your commitment to explore what next in building a community wealth building model here. We have started the journey within the Department for Communities, and my ambition is to embed this right across the heart of government within local government. I know that the wider executive will be keenly interested in the recommendations of the expert panel when they produce their report later this year. And again, I just want to thank you for taking the time. Thank you again to the Development Trust for the invitation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Let's build community wealth building together.
Well, thank you to the Minister for that address. Sorry about the buffering on the video there, but we did get the audio clear as a bell. I think that's the important part. And I think that there's a couple of things just to draw out from what the Minister said there. The current situation, the current crisis in our economy, I think does flag up the systemic weaknesses in our economy. And this is perhaps a moment in which they can be addressed. I think also what was important there is just the illustration of that this is a real moment of opportunity for community wealth building within the Minister's department, that there are people who are on board there who are taking that seriously now that there is an evidence base being built up. And I think we've also seen that in other executive departments recently as well, for example, in the Department of Finance and some of the things which they have done around procurement. When I come on to speak to Ted, I think one of the things I want to ask him about is just the best way to engage with government and the state whenever you're trying to advance community wealth building, and what lessons we might take from other places. And as I say, our keynote speaker today is Ted Howard. He's the co-founder and president of the Democracy Collaborative. It's an action-oriented, progressive think tank for the democratic economy, which was established 20 years ago in the US. It began at the University of Maryland, College Park, as an academic research centre. Today, it's an independent, non-profit organisation. Ted has been described by the Guardian newspaper as the de facto spokesperson for community wealth building internationally. He's one of the originators of the international movement among anchor tenants, including health systems, anchor institutions, I should say, including health systems, universities, culture and art centres, to leverage their economic power, including their supply chains, hiring practices and investment policies to benefit local communities. And if that sounds similar to the Preston model, then it should be, because the work he did with communities in Cleveland was a major inspiration to the Preston folk. Ted lectures frequently about system change and community wealth building. So let's hear what he has to say. And can I just ask everybody just to check before Ted starts that their mics are muted, when we'll have listen to Ted for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we will have a bit of a chat. Ted, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you all for being here today. I bring you greetings from Denver, Colorado, where I am in the United States. It's about 20 minutes past 7 in the morning here. Shortly, since I'm facing east, you'll probably see sun starting to stream into the room. First, let me thank Charlie and all of his colleagues at DTNI for extending the invitation to speak with you today. Were she here, I would love to thank Minister for Communities Deirdre Hargey for her powerful remarks and her commitment to community wealth building. It's also good to see a number of friends here from Trademark, from CLES. Hello, Sarah. Longlands. I know everyone here knows that CLES is the premier community wealth building organization in the British Isles, and it's great to hear that CLES is going to be involved here in Northern Ireland ongoing. Also wanted to just make note to you all that I see a number of my colleagues at the Democracy Collaborative have signed on. Sarah McKinley, Joe Guinan, Neil McEnroy, who's known to many of you, Celie Recio, our Director of Communications, Isaiah Poole, and Katrina Bukovac. So to all of you on staff, thank you for making time to be with us today. I've been asked to speak with you about community wealth building, what it is, and crucially, what it is not. And I'd like to share with you the journey that some of us have been on over the past decade and a half, as we have turned an idea into a reality. Let me begin just by acknowledging that I've yet to visit Northern Ireland, and I hope to do so in 2022. While I have been briefed about the community wealth building journey many of you are on, I certainly don't know all the details. And I'm quite sure that some of the terminology we use in the United States may not be usual in Northern Ireland. So I ask, therefore, your indulgence in my remarks and forgiveness if I step in something that I shouldn't be stepping in. Let's begin by defining deep transformative community wealth building and, importantly, the rationale behind it. Ownership and control of assets is the foundation of every political economic system and largely determines who has access to wealth and power and who does not. In the United States, it is a well-known fact that asset ownership is concentrated to an extraordinary degree. As a former chairman of the United States Central Bank, what we call the Federal Reserve, warned in 2018, the United States is, quote, developing into a plutocracy. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this trend toward ever greater concentration of wealth in society. United States billionaires, for instance, have seen their wealth surge $1.8 trillion during the pandemic, their collective fortunes skyrocketing by nearly 2/3 from just short of $3 trillion at the start of the COVID crisis to $4.8 trillion as of last summer. This is a truly medieval, feudal concentration of wealth. In my view, and I suspect in the view of you as well, we need to move beyond economies that consistently generate ever greater wealth inequality and are overwhelmingly shaped and driven by the needs of capital and investors, and where labor, working people, and communities are simply considered a cost on the balance sheet. To address this growing wealth inequality, we need to build wealth in our communities, creating economies where assets are broadly held and locally rooted over the long term, so that income recirculates locally, creating stable prosperity. Doing this requires us to develop plural forms of ownership across the full spectrum of assets, resources, enterprise, and services that collectively can transfer wealth and power from the hands of the few to the control of the many. Now, one way to do this is through community wealth building, a term that my organization, the Democracy Collaborative, first articulated in the mid-2000s. Our intent was to tie together the innovative institutions and approaches that we saw emerging in communities all over the world and that offer a vision of a new type of political economy at the local level. Community wealth building emerged more than a decade and a half ago to challenge the underlying logic and failures of the trickle-down neoliberal economic development model as it is practiced in cities and states all over the United States, as well as in many other countries, including in Europe. Community wealth building works to produce broadly shared economic prosperity through the reconfiguration of institutions and local economies on the basis of greater democratic control, democratic ownership, and participation. It is a new way of thinking about economic development, poverty alleviation, and wealth creation and accumulation. However, its truly transformative potential is that it takes a full system view that focuses on developing alternative economic institutions that are broadly owned and offer new relationships and interventions at various scales throughout the local economy. The goal is not to simply build one-off projects, a co-op here, a social enterprise there, nor to tinker around the edges to attempt to even out the malign effects of our current deeply unequal and unjust economic model, but instead to pursue fundamental changes to the ordinary operations of the system, to literally rewire our local economies such that they are capable of reliably generating positive outcomes in and of itself. Now, just imagine that. What if we could intentionally construct a local Belfast economy that is designed to produce the kinds of outcomes we would all want. Better wages and greater wealth equality, more stability for our workers and families, more democratic communities, better results for our environment and the planet's climate. Imagine if each day we woke up and Belfast and its citizenry were just a little bit better off than the day before, simply because the local economic system worked in a way to produce those outcomes. Just imagine that and kind of hold that thought in your head as I give you some examples of where community wealth building is expressing itself around the world. Among the local elements that we consider key to growing community wealth are anchors, anchor institutions, public spending, finance, land and property, work and labor, and inclusive ownership. This is a list that has been developed by the Center for Local Economic Strategies in the main, and one that we embrace in the Democracy Collaborative. In the interest of time, let me just describe 2 of these elements. I won't go through all 6. Anchors. Anchor institutions are commercial, public, and social sector organizations with a significant stake in a place, and they can be agents of economic change as employers, purchasers, land and property owners, and financial investors. Crucially, they are rooted in place. They rarely get up and leave. Universities, healthcare systems, municipal governments, they are in the community for the long haul. We need to unleash their economic energy with greater action regarding questions of equity. Here in Northern Ireland, in addition to these large-scale anchors I've talked about, the development trust can also rightly be considered a local community anchor all over your country. And let's look at spending, public spending. Taking a progressive approach to procurement is a means through which greater economic and social justice can be achieved for local places and people. Increased local spend creates jobs, contributing to a multiplier effect, which in turn creates additional jobs by way of increased demand for local goods and services. When this spending is targeted at broadly owned and socially minded enterprises, then workers and local communities benefit in new and exciting ways. So all of that is the underlying theory of community wealth building. But what does it look like in practice? I'd like now to share some real-life examples of how it has expressed itself in communities on the ground and the arc of its evolution over these past 15 or so years, because we are all in a dynamic process as community wealth building evolves through practice and feeding back to the theory into new and dynamic and at greater scale approaches to building local wealth. Now, while the specific term and framework of community wealth building is fairly recent, as I said, about 15 years old, there are many rivulets of activity that have flown into it over centuries. For example, traditional indigenous communities in North America who believe that land should be held in common by the whole people of their tribe rather than exploited by individual ownership. In England, in the 1840s, the Rochdale pioneers built the first consumer and worker cooperatives. In the United States South, after our Civil War, where freed slaves and their descendants began cooperatives, and later during our Civil Rights Movement, when Black farmers created early forms of land trusting. In the state of North Dakota in the US, where the early 20th century progressive movement led to the establishment of the Bank of North Dakota, a socialized, state-owned financial institution of, by, and for the people of the state. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, North Dakota is one of the most conservative political states in the United States, and yet it's the only one that has a socialized public bank of this kind. We also see the movement evolving in the large-scale worker cooperatives of Mondragon in Spain, the cooperatives in Emilia-Romagna in Italy, and the co-op networks of Quebec in Canada. or the Ujamaa philosophy that was the foundation for Julius Nyereri's social and economic development in Tanzania, and the early kibbutz experiments in Israel. All of these feed into shaping what is community wealth building and so many other influences over time. Now, 2 years ago, Marjorie Kelly and I wrote a book about all this called The Making of a Democratic Economy, Prosperity for the Many, Not Just the Few. And as Charlie mentioned, this book is available to those of you in this gathering. The book tells the story of people in many communities who are working to build a democratic economy using the tools of community wealth building. So I'd like to tell you some of those stories for the remainder of my remarks with you. So let's begin with the place I know well, Cleveland, Ohio. I lived there for the past decade before relocating here during the pandemic to Denver. Back in the 1950s and 60s, Cleveland was one of the 5 wealthiest cities in America. There are more Fortune 500 corporations headquartered there than any city outside of Manhattan, New York City. Nearly 1 million people lived in Cleveland in those days, but after a long period of deindustrialization and businesses and jobs being offshored, Cleveland became what we call a Rust Belt city, and it's now one of the 3 poorest cities in the United States. The population has decreased from almost 1 million to less than 400,000 people, and only 2 or 3 Fortune 500 corporations remain in Cleveland. Fully 1/3 of the city's population lives below the poverty line. But what Cleveland did have, even in the face of this decline, it had an extraordinary asset, and that was a network of legacy public and nonprofit institutions that first began during the city's manufacturing heyday. Together, these anchor institutions purchased many billions of dollars of goods and services annually, but until recently, most of the purchasing didn't come from the city's businesses, but from Los Angeles, or Mexico, or China, or anywhere but Cleveland and Ohio. But around 2009, the Democracy Collaborative, in partnership with the city's government, local philanthropy, and major anchor institutions, launched a targeted neighborhood community wealth building strategy in a bid to keep money from leaking out of the city and provide jobs and economic opportunity for city residents, particularly those who are locked in poverty and were unemployed. Deliberately created to supply goods and services directly to the large place-based anchors that are rooted in the community, principally universities and hospitals, these evergreen cooperatives, as we call them, were purposely built as green worker-owned companies. 2 industrial-scale green laundry facilities capable of cleaning tens of millions of pounds of sheets and towels and doctors' gowns and so forth. A large urban hydroponic greenhouse capable of growing indoors 3 million heads of lettuce per year, an energy production and retrofitting company, and others. Owned by their workers, not outside investors, but linked by a company serving nonprofit corporation and a revolving loan fund, the individual companies cannot be easily sold to private interests, nor can they easily exit the community of Cleveland. So in a very real sense, these businesses have themselves become anchor institutions in the community. What the cooperatives are doing is recirculatory, multiplying and growing wealth locally for the people who create the wealth in the first place. All of this is reinforced by a robust community wealth ecosystem that we've put in place that includes local businesses, anchor institutions, philanthropy, financial institutions, the city government, and neighborhood associations. But what most distinguishes this model is that it is designed to benefit not only the individuals and the companies, but also the community as a whole. The co-ops are networked together by a community-controlled holding company that gives the local stakeholders a say in the direction of the co-ops. This holding company receives a percentage of profits from each co-op so that other businesses can be built. And in 2018, Evergreen launched what they call the Fund for Employee Ownership to acquire local small and medium-sized businesses and convert them to employee ownership and bring them into the supportive network. To date, they've acquired an insulation installation business, a technology and robotics firm, and a network of 5 local coffee shops. Many cities in the US are now experimenting in their own ways with this model. The next evolutionary leap for community wealth building didn't happen in the United States, but it happened on your side of the Atlantic in Preston, England. Preston took up the Cleveland model, as was said earlier, and radically expanded it, turning it from a neighborhood initiative to a full citywide economic strategy. As you probably know, Preston is an older industrial city in the north of England that had fallen on hard times. When I first visited Preston in 2012, I was told that it was known as the suicide capital of the United Kingdom due to the lack of economic opportunity. And I found a high street that was filled with boarded up storefronts and bankrupt businesses. In short, Preston was a poster child for left behind places. To address this very challenging situation, the Preston City Council, working closely with the Center for Local Economic Strategies, has driven a comprehensive community wealth building strategy that includes repatriating anchor institution procurement that has returned more than £75 million to the local economy and more than £200 million to Lancashire County. Public employee pension fund investment on the high street to the tune of £100 million, partnering with the University of Central Lancashire to incubate co-ops, and laying the groundwork for the development of a community bank capitalized by using reserves of the city and county. A city that was once in the bottom 20% of the country's most deprived communities has now been named by Demos and PricewaterhouseCoopers as the most improved community in the nation for 2 years in a row. And again, other communities in England are taking up this model. I'd like to just say a few words about North Ayrshire in Scotland. In May, I'll be visiting North Ayrshire for the first time. The local authority there is pioneering Scotland's first community wealth building strategy as their basis for recovering in the post-COVID-19 period, but also as a means of delivering on a local Green New Deal. The city's economic plan is, in fact, now a community wealth building plan. The goal is to develop a new economic model for the region centered on inclusion and well-being. To do so, they are leveraging their annual income, their revenue budget, as well as their capital program, housing building program, and a £251 million growth deal from the Scottish government. There are many exciting things happening in North Ayrshire, building broad-based plural models of ownership, developing cooperatives, employee ownership of a hotel, advanced plans for a solar farm, social enterprises, and the like. So I look forward to coming over to Scotland soon to see this. And then back to the United States. Inspired by the kind of all of city strategy that a Preston's adopted or a North Ayrshire has adopted, United States cities with whom we're working are now looking at what is their own all of city, all of government strategy. One of the cities we're working with is the city of Chicago, the third largest in the United States. We were approached by this city's Office of Equity and Racial Justice to help them conceive, focus, and implement a comprehensive community wealth building strategy. That strategy is now under development. At the end of this month or early April, we'll issue a report. We'd be happy to make available to you of what Chicago, this very large municipality, is doing in terms of community wealth building. The city has just announced their commitment to its first $15 million community wealth pilot project, and many other very interesting things are starting to happen in America's third largest city. Meanwhile, in New York City, our largest urban area, the city government has issued a fascinating full-blown strategy called Policies for Municipal Community Wealth Building. And finally, I want to just share with you the news, which is you're the first to hear actually, that in the US federal government, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the largest funder of urban economic development in the country, with a 2022 budget of $68 billion, has embraced community wealth building in their new 4-year strategic plan. In the words of the department, they seek, quote, to promote equitable community development that generates wealth building, particularly for underserved communities. There'll be a formal government announcement about this. This is the first time this has been done in the United States. And now we see the movement expanding around the world. In Sydney, Australia, the City of Sydney has issued a very detailed report on their community wealth building strategy. If you go to the city's website now, you'll see an entire page asking residents to, quote, share your insights into the principles of community wealth building and how they could be applied in Sydney to reduce inequality and ensure more people share in the city's prosperity. Finally, just a word about the Scottish National Government. Community wealth building is now part of the Scottish Government's programme for government. A Minister for Public Finance, Planning and Community Wealth, Tom Arthur, a member of the Scottish Parliament, has been named. This makes Mr. Arthur the first minister in the entire world with community wealth in his title. And now a National Community Wealth Building Act is being developed for introduction into the Parliament in late 2023. So let me conclude now quickly with a few thoughts on Northern Ireland. As I've said, I've not visited your country, and my knowledge is certainly limited, much more than yours. But I do want to just say a few words about the possibilities of community wealth building in Northern Ireland. First, I believe you have a massive opportunity. The question is, will you play catch up or do piecemeal work, or can you take the leap to the cutting edge of community wealth building around the world? On the one hand, you have a decades-long history of regressive privatization, failed neoliberal economic development, extractive inward investment, and all the rest, a familiar story for many countries. But on the other, you have a proud tradition of doing for yourselves, a wide range of forms of community ownership throughout your country, strong community-based work through the development trusts that are grounded in the place and realities where they're based. Can community wealth building, deep, transformative community wealth building, be successfully done in Northern Ireland, even with all of your challenges, even with your history? Quite simply, I believe the answer is a resounding yes. All administrations across the world are complex, and yours is no different. You have your own complexities, your own limitations, your own regulations. However, I would say that all places, cities, regions, and nations where I've worked have the same kinds of complexities and have the same competing priorities, silos, rivalries, and inertias. The key point about community wealth building is it can be a unifying force, a golden thread, if you will, that can help to join up and, if need be, cut through the fog of government and bureaucracy and truly deliver an economy that works for all communities. If a highly complex and deeply divided city like Chicago, or a poor community like Preston or Cleveland, or a nation like Scotland can embark on a community wealth journey, then any place can. And let me say that this is my last word. I do mean any place. Several years ago, the Democracy Collaborative had the privilege of working with Indigenous people, the Oglala Sioux, who live on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, to support them on their own community wealth building journey. There are no more challenging circumstances in the United States than on Pine Ridge, where the unemployment rate is greater than 80%, and the life expectancy of an adult is just 46%. And yet today, even in the face of these circumstances, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, there's a thriving community wealth building effort as the tribe has taken command of its own destiny, developing a green economy, eco-community, creating worker cooperatives, providing meaningful work for their people, building and owning a cultural center, and so much more. So if it could be done on the reservation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, you can certainly do it here in Northern Ireland. I'm quite sure you have everything you need already to set about building this new economy. using your own resources in your own communities. After all, no one is coming to save us, but our future and that of our communities is in our hands. And community wealth building, deep, rich, transformative community wealth building, can be a foundation for that future. The great physicist and Nobel laureate Albert Einstein once said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Never were these words truer than today when we look at the need to rebuild the basis of our economic life. Let us think and act newly and boldly together as we build democratic local economies and as we build a global community wealth movement for the next stage of our shared history. Thank you very much.
Ted, thank you. Thank you for that inspiring, really global tour there of what is possible. The thing which immediately occurs to me is that there wasn't just one morning where bureaucrats and politicians in Chicago or Sydney or at the HUD woke up and said, okay, right, we're going to do community wealth building. Work had to be done. People had to be persuaded. What is the best way, do you think, to actually persuade governments or other existing centres of power that this is a thing worth doing? You're on mute.
So sorry.
No problem.
I do think it is a matter of persuasion, and I'll speak to that. But more than that, I think what we often face with our local governments, I'll speak for the United States, is a profound failure of imagination. To actually, remember I said, imagine that in Belfast we could have an economy that every day produces better outcomes. We all assume we live in economies that produce worse outcomes every day. We take that for granted, but it takes a real imagination to see, no, we can really, this whole system is built by people like us. We can rebuild it and we can get what we want from it. In terms of persuasion, I think there are a number of elements I've seen. One, it's very important that our city officials understand, even when we're facing serious austerity or deprivation, there actually is a lot of money circulating in the system. The problem is it keeps leaking out of it. So in some cities in America, we've actually done what are called leakage studies to show public authorities how much money is leaving the system and how much of it could be brought back. That's one thing. I think it's very important first to expose people also in terms of persuasion to the stories that I tried to share, and there are many more, that this is not merely theory. Preston was in the bottom % of the deprivation index of England, and it's now risen to one of the most improved communities. That is reality. That happened in 8 years. Is it perfect? No. But look what Preston did in the face of profound austerity. I think there's also persuasion, John, that needs to be done in terms of redefining what do we mean by return on investment. When the evergreen cooperatives, for instance, it's not just benefiting the people working there, but those companies now, because they're for-profit worker cooperatives, they're returning millions of dollars back into the city through taxes that are benefiting the school system and paving the roads and doing all the things we need. So I think the persuasion needs to come from a kind of a profound reimagination and focusing on these things. Last thing I'd say is for local elected officials, and we've seen in the United States, and we saw it actually in your last elections in the UK, community wealth building is politically popular. When the Red Wall crumbled in Northern England, the places that didn't crumble and stayed with Labour, I'm not saying this is only a Labour issue, but the ones that did stay Labour were places like Preston that had fully embraced community wealth building rather than the extractive model. So there is a certain political advantage to embracing this style of development.
That's interesting you mentioned the Red Wall, because if we look at what the UK government is talking about now in terms of levelling up in particular, they have now created, I think, an expectation that there will be place-based economic development, something which for a long time was unfashionable. So I suppose and what we're, I doubt very much that, the people pushing the levelling up are, advocates of the democratic economy necessarily, but surely there must be an extent to which we are pushing an open door now. If you have policies which talk about those sorts of things, you will probably be listened to in a way you mightn't have been in the past.
I think you're right. I think a lot of the leveling up is rhetoric. We'll see if the resources come with it. But it does provide an opening, I think, whatever party you're in, it does provide an opening to advance an argument. And the argument we need to advance, I believe, is, well, if we're really talking about leveling up, what is the way to really do that that's sustainable and most inclusive and so forth? And that brings you to the, at least in my mind, to the case that we're making today at this conference.
And I suppose the fact that Preston exists and they've done what they've done as well also makes it a little bit easier in that you can say, well, listen, it's there, it's happening, you can go and see for yourself. It's doable.
I think that's exactly right. In the United States, I don't know if you have the phrase, but we talk about seeing something and kicking the tires, that it's really real. Certainly Evergreen did that. Again, all of these models are imperfect and it's always involving humans. And whenever you involve humans like us, it gets messy and everything else. But nonetheless, that we could demonstrate that in the most impoverished neighborhoods in Cleveland, Ohio, we could build productive and profitable worker-owned companies employing, at one point, it's a little bit less now, but at one point 50% of the workforce were what we call, in the United States at least, returning citizens, formerly incarcerated people who the system had written off. And yet we built companies that the workers themselves owned, people who had all sorts of disadvantages, and they're outperforming their competitors. And that shows that this is real. And I think Preston is exactly the same. There's a new book out by a gentleman who's become a friend. I'll hold it up. It's called Davos Man, and it's by Peter Goodman. So it's about the billionaires at Davos. It's by Peter Goodman, who's the global economics correspondent for the New York Times. And I got to know him over time and really encouraged him to go to Preston and meet the head of council, Matthew Brown, and his colleagues. I encouraged him to go to Mondragon and so forth, and he did those things. And so in this book, the first 16 chapters are about how wealth is being concentrated and billionaires are gobbling up all the resources. But then at chapter 17, he makes the pivot and basically says, is there any alternative to this? This is rampaging all over the world. And the chapter 17 begins, like much of surrounding Lancashire County in northwest England, Preston was nurtured by the Industrial Revolution. And then he tells the story of the Preston model. Going to see it, as you said, because it's real and in place, opens and unlocks the imagination for someone who's even a global economics reporter for the New York Times.
I just want to ask you something about anchor institutions.
Yes.
So clearly they are key to this sort of model. They have the resources, and it's about how those resources are channeled. And I suppose in an ideal world, you're saying, yeah, they channel their resources, they procure from worker-owned cooperatives, those sorts of organisations. But I guess initially you can't be too precious. You will be in a position where you are just contracting with fairly conventional private sector businesses, albeit you can set certain standards in terms of what your procurement is. That maybe there's a bit of realism at the start there. That it is just going to be about looking for those locally rooted businesses. But to a large extent, they would just be a conventional private sector business you're working with.
Well, I'll tell you our experience in the United States, and actually I think it's the experience in Preston. The anchor institutions that we tend to focus on tend to be either not-for-profit institutions, different kinds of universities, for instance, or public institutions the kind, not just investor-driven corporations. And there's a whole question, well, can big business be an anchor institution? I would argue not, because I think the heart of the definition is they are rooted in place and indeed have some sort of quasi-social or public mission. What we have found in the United States, for instance, working with, as you know, we don't actually have a health system in America. We think it would be a very good thing to have, but we have a whole bunch of individual hospitals and systems everywhere. We've been working with a network of about 65 hospitals over the last 7 years, health systems that represent, they're the biggest in the country. They represent more than one of every, I think, 8 hospitals in the entire United States. And we've been able to work with them over time to say, don't just make a gesture to give a couple contracts to local businesses. We need you to operate in a different way. And we framed something we called the anchor mission, that to leverage the resources and all the activities of the institutions to benefit their local communities. So, for instance, we created a pledge among these institutions to take just 1% of their investment portfolio off of Wall Street and invest it on Main Street. In other words, invest it locally on housing and business development and so forth. And that resulted in $700 million, just 1%, flowing into communities. Now we're doing the same thing with purchasing. So I think there's a way in dialogue to move these institutions to not just be making kind of gestures toward things, but for them to even see it in their self-interest. One very quickly, I had a really interesting interaction with the head of the police authority in Preston. And they're one of the anchor institutions that decided they were going to buy local, move their contracts locally and so forth. And I said, why is a police department doing this? A police authority, this doesn't seem, I've never heard of it. We've never done it in the United States. And he said, we consider it part of our mission to make safer communities. That if we're buying locally, we're creating conditions of greater economic prosperity and inclusion locally. That's going to provide more jobs for people. That is, we think, going to lead to less crime. So I think as institutions start to see their role as civic actors in this way, you can actually move them towards something meaningful.
It's a question from, well, it's more of a comment from Karen Arbuckle, which I think is just worth engaging with, which is around the climate and energy crisis. And surely this must be a moment of opportunity also for community wealth building. And when we look at everything that has to be done, the amount of investment which is going to be required to reach net zero in economies across the world.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity. You know, as we try to make this transition to a net zero world and a more sustainable world, the question becomes, we're going to have to make large public investments. Are we going to give the large public investments to some of the very same actors that help get us to the point where we're in crisis now? Or are we going to use these investments to build up whole new sectors of activity, not related to climate, but related in another manner? This is what I mean. In the state of Virginia, the state decided during the pandemic, because children were learning remotely, and so many kids in households, particularly in rural areas and poor urban areas, had very bad, internet access and bandwidth, so it harmed their learning. The state said, okay, we've got to take care of this, and we're going to invest $700 million to build out the new digital infrastructure of our state. That's a huge opportunity, but what did the state do? And mind you, this was under a liberal Democratic governor.
See where this is going.
Parentheses, who should know better. They gave the $700 million to the big tech telecom industry, which will be able to build out, this infrastructure, but it leaves nothing meaningful behind except you've got the infrastructure, whereas you could have used the $700 million to capitalize a state-owned or some kind of broader ownership telecom, which many cities in the United States have done. And then you would not only get the infrastructure, but you would own the company, and it would be in place in serving the needs of the citizens. And I think there's an analogy for how we need to treat the investments in the Green New Deal and the fight against climate change.
Can I just ask you one final question,
Sure.
which is in the process of writing the latest book and touring the book, do you feel optimistic?
That's a good question. Optimism is not a coin I deal in. What I do feel is there is I've been involved in activism and social movements, all that, for my entire career, which now is going on 50 years. And I don't feel I've ever seen a moment of greater possibility for true transformation than the one we're in now. I think there's the shocks of what occurred in the pandemic and with people and the economies, the previous shock 10 years before with the Great Recession. There's a new openness I'm finding among people everywhere who are not seeing something like community wealth building as, well, it's some left-wing or socialist ideology. It starts to make sense. These are our communities. So I think it's almost like there's a new place for community and community thinking that is evolving now. So I guess maybe in that sense, I feel optimistic. The hurdles are absolutely enormous. Some days one doesn't want to get out of bed when you see what's in the news, but I feel there really is something occurring around the world now that is about taking back control of our lives and our local economies in a way that I haven't seen before.
Ted, I think we will take that as an optimistic note to close on. And there's a comment here from Neil McElroy in the chat just saying it's worth noting that in 2013, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies with Belfast City Council did a full anchor institution study. They had a plan moving forward. It preceded the Preston model, but sadly it wasn't taken forward in Belfast. Hopefully, maybe now we are in a place where that sort of work can be revisited. Hopefully, potentially, as you were saying, there's a community mindset now, which makes that possible. And that will also nicely set up who is going to be the first speaker in our second session. But just to close, I would like to thank you for taking part today. People can kind of knock Zoom and the technology, but it makes it so much easier for people like you to engage with your international experience. Hopefully, in the not too distant future, we will be able to see you in person in Belfast. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to DTNI for the invitation to be with you today. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that leads us nicely on to our next section today. And our first speaker in today's second session is Sarah Longlands, the Chief Executive of the aforementioned Centre for Local Economic Strategy, which describes itself as the curator of the community wealth building movement in the UK. Sarah is an expert in regional and local economic development and a former director of the IPPR North think tank. And she is going to give us the wider UK perspective in what is happening in community wealth building. Sarah, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, John. And it's quite an ask to follow in the footsteps of Ted. And I just want to pay tribute to him and the rest of the Democracy Collaborative for all their support as fellow travellers in the journey to a better economy for everyone. And I was really struck by Ted's comments at the end there about it is a really difficult time, I think, right. With so many challenges, both internationally and locally. But I do share his sense that if there was ever a time to try and move things forward, to disrupt the inertia, it is now. And I also share his optimism about the potential here in Northern Ireland, and that's as much for the fact that it's where I grew up and a place that I have a huge amount of respect and love for, but also because of the fact that Northern Ireland deserves this. It deserves an economy that works in the interest of everyone in order to build a better and shared future. I also just wanted to thank DTNI and Trademark for the invitation to come along today and to work with them on this project. And finally, I also wanted to just pay tribute to Neil McEnroy on this call as well, who has, because much of what I'll say today really builds on the strong foundations that he developed during his time at CLES. So John already gave you a bit of an introduction to CLES. We describe ourselves as that sort of national organisation for local economies, and we were established in the 1980s. And our mission has always been about how do we build better economies which really work in the interests of people, place, and planet. And we are different to a lot of other organisations in this space in the UK, certainly because we really focus our attention on what happens at the local level, and not just about thinking about solutions or trying to dream up solutions, but actually trying to deliver them and trying to deliver better solutions that really work to not only to support people, but also to give places a sense of purpose and presence, if you like, in the future. And in the UK, I think it's just worth reflecting on where we are. I mean, I've been asked to speak about that UK context, and I guess the context for community wealth building in the UK seems on the surface to be less than unhelpful, I would suggest. You've got a right of centre government with a huge majority who believe in the power of the market rather than of the state, and that poverty is an inevitable outcome of the economy. And there's also a focus on economic growth at all costs as the objective of economic policy. And it's striking yesterday listening to the Chancellor Spring's statement that there's a real failure to engage with just how wonky our economy really is. The Chancellor used the phrase that we needed to share the proceeds of growth fairly. But of course, by the time those proceeds have been created, it's far too late, because those with the greatest influence and the deepest and the vested interest, if you like, will be able to cream off the majority of the wealth. What we need, and what community wealth building tries to do, as Ted outlined, is we need to build the economy differently, which is about changing the structure of ownership, changing the structure of how the economy operates, and most importantly, changing mindsets and disrupting the inertias that continue to replicate this flawed model across the UK. And within the UK government, the big driver of that is the Treasury, which is very much wedded to traditional economic orthodoxy, which it then exports to local authorities and devolved administrations through what we have as a very centralised machinery of government in the UK. So things like a dependence on inward investment, on the idea of agglomeration, where cities are seen as the drivers of growth, the deregulation of planning, and a friendly fiscal environment for big capital, for big business. And yet there are also some, within even this government, there are even some signs of a willingness to think about community wealth building. For example, there has been acknowledgement of the power of procurement and the potential of pension funds and the use of anchor institutions. But that only is at the minute is only surface, and it only goes so far. And I guess part of the opportunity in the UK is that the real energy for community wealth building is coming up from the regional and the local, where the conversation is all about how we build and rewire our economy differently so that it works in the interests of people and place. And at the heart of that question is around ownership and how we unlock our economic wealth to give everyone a stake in the future. And the fact that we have such a, you might say, unfriendly national context for the economy almost gives fuel to that fire, that desire to grow something differently at a local and regional level. Because as Ted said, no one is coming to save us. And increasingly, local authorities and their partners and communities in areas across England particularly are looking to themselves to come up with their own plans as how they start to redevelop and rewire their economies in the interests of their communities. And that is what has happened in Preston. And as Ted said, we now know that many other local authorities, local partners, local organisations are leading, are taking their example and leading with community wealth building to varying degrees. And our work is very much about developing and deepening those solutions so that we can create that greater economic inclusion for everyone. So just to give you some examples of what's happening on a local level in England particularly, as I said, there is huge and growing interest in this agenda, and it's not just with local government or councils that would be Labour. It's across the board, and there's a real appetite for change and a recognition that the old ways of doing things are no longer sufficient to the challenges that we face in post-pandemic recovery, climate emergency, and now, of course, cost of living and energy transition as well. So, for example, Lewis, a small rural district in the southeast of England, where the council is working with its neighbouring district councils to retrofit its housing stock. It's a 10-year partnership, and the aim is to grow green jobs, green businesses, and develop new opportunities for construction, for apprenticeships and young people who live there, and very much linked to community-run renewables. Small area, not a lot of money within the council, but a real willingness and a desire to try and do something differently and to break the inertia that they can see in their area, and going really well. And then at the other extreme, places like Birmingham, where we've been working for years, where some of their biggest anchor institutions are working alongside smaller anchor organisations. So you've got the NHS, the might of the NHS, working alongside smaller housing associations to really try to think about how they can streamline their recruitment processes, so that they can make sure that the people don't have unnecessary barriers to access employment and training, and can easily get into work, training and progression, and particularly those from the most disadvantaged communities. So lots of exciting and interesting work happening at the local level, and lots of enthusiasm to try and understand and map just how well or how poorly local economies are working, and trying to understand how much wealth is leaving places and how much wealth is locked up already in areas that just needs to be shared out and distributed fairly. At the regional level in the UK, as Ted said, Scotland is really probably at the forefront of the movement in the UK, with, as Ted said, a Minister for Community Wealth, Public Finance and Planning. And also with that exciting prospect of legislation coming forward next year to really provide clout to the agenda, and to try and systematise change across the Scottish Government. And there are also a number of local authority areas which are developing and piloting community wealth building approaches on a range of different themes, ranging from vacant and derelict land in Glasgow to peatland restoration in the Western Isles, and looking at the climate change emergency in Dundee. Lots of local authorities in Scotland really taking the bull by the horns and trying to see how they could do things differently, and trying to take the next steps forward on that journey. I know that Aine is going to talk about Wales, so I will leave her to do that. But again, huge enthusiasm and leadership there in Wales in trying to do something differently. In England also, we've got the mayoral combined authorities, so devolved arrangements for more than 10 areas across England, which have, but not all of them, a directly elected mayor. And there's a lot of energy now in those areas to develop a community wealth building approach. So, for example, in Greater Manchester and in the Sheffield City region, there's the development of a new ownership hub in both areas, which is a community wealth building hub to try and diversify ownership within the city region, trying to provide a different pathway for people to get a stake in their local economy, to cooperatives, worker ownership, and community enterprise. And that's really, at the devolved level, an opportunity to diverge from the HM Treasury model. And also, as the Minister said, we've been working with the Department of Communities here in Northern Ireland. And I just wanted to finish off by saying a little bit about the work that we've been doing there. So CLES has been working with the Department of Communities and some of their senior leaders to really explore the potential of community wealth building in Northern Ireland. And that follows all of the work that we've done previously with Belfast, as Neil says, and that we're also doing in Newrymore and Down at the present moment in time. And in our work with the department, we've been really struck by the ideas and the commitment to the agenda here in Northern Ireland, and the different ways in which the department is using its own influence to really build a more inclusive economy. And that's through legislation, through direct policy, but also through its economic role, and thirdly, through its enabling and influencing role. And despite the progress being made, there is huge potential to deepen that approach in the longer term, particularly through the department's programmes for regeneration, including the city deals, city region deals, which are now being rolled out, local labour market partnerships and community planning. And I think we've been hugely excited and encouraged by what we are seeing within the department at the current time, and think that huge potential to take that work forward and to deepen it in partnership with local areas around Northern Ireland. So I'm gonna leave it there. But thanks again to everyone for coming along this afternoon, and to DTNI and to Trademark for the invitation. And I look forward to exploring this further with you during the conversation. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. And like I say, keep your questions coming in the Zoom chat. Lots of interesting comments in there already, so keep across that. Now, I don't know how closely you follow the economic policy environment across the different parts of the UK, but if you've paid any attention to Wales in recent years, you will definitely have heard of something called the foundational economy. And the Institute for Welsh Affairs describes it, on the one hand, a description of a series of economic activities that represent the basic requirements of everyday life, such as energy, housing, or care, for which demand is non-negotiable and supply is rooted in places where people live. On the other hand, they say the foundational economy is an approach to analysis that represents a radical critique. Aine Gawthorpe is the Deputy Director for Foundational Economy at the Welsh Government, and she's going to explain to us what that concept is and how it relates to community wealth building. Aine, thank you.
Sorry, struggling to get my slides up and turn
No
off
problem.
mute at the same time. I'm hoping you
There you
can
go.
see those slides
Yeah,
now.
we can see your slides. Yeah, great.
Okay, fantastic. So hello everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to come in and talk a little bit about the work of the Foundational Economy unit in Welsh Government. I thought it was worth starting with a bit of an introduction around really the legislation that underpins the work that we do, and particularly our engagement around adoption of a community wealth building approach and engagement with anchor institutions. And that's the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015. So this is about effectively improving the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, and about how we can work together to do that. It's quite groundbreaking legislation at the time that it was brought in. There's a couple of really kind of key points that it brings in. Firstly is a sustainable development principle. So there is a requirement on public bodies to act in a way that ensures that the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And really importantly, it puts in place 7 well-being goals. But these aren't just vague goals. There is a requirement on public bodies in Wales to work to achieving all 7 of these goals, and not a case of picking and choosing which ones they want to work for. And public bodies have to publish an annual report showing the progress they've made against this, and are held to account by the Future Generations Commissioner and the Auditor General for Wales. So I'll just give it a little bit more detail around them. So a prosperous Wales is about ensuring we have a low carbon society which uses resources efficiently and innovatively, focusing on having a skilled and well-educated population, and an economy that generates wealth and provides employment, and most importantly, fair and decent work. Resilient Wales is about having a biodiverse natural environment that supports social, economic and ecological resilience. And Healthier Wales is about maximising people's physical and mental well-being, but also ensuring that choices and behaviours that benefit future health are understood and acted on. A more equal Wales is about enabling people to fulfil their potential no matter what their background or circumstances. And a Wales of cohesive communities, I think, kind of speaks for itself. It's about having an attractive, viable, safe and well-connected communities in Wales. A Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language is really critical. And then globally responsible Wales is about whenever we're doing anything that's looking at improving the economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, that we're also considering whether it may make a positive contribution to global well-being. So that's the kind of whistle stop to the Future Generations Act. And as I said, that very much underpins the work that we do in the Foundational Economy Unit. So we are a small team dedicated to delivering what is a key Welsh Government commitment to support the foundational economy, which, as John said, is what's quite often described in Wales as the everyday economy. So the goods and services that are needed for everyday life and are consumed by all households. And our work is kind of referred to as foundational economy, but very much underpinning that, and Minister's view and understanding of it is underpinned by community wealth building principles. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information about the sort of the current work that's going on in that area, and then the development of the policy and strategy taking forward. So I won't go into massive detail, but we set up Challenge Fund projects in 2019, and this was very much about being innovative and experimental. So trying to kind of challenge the deep-rooted issues and the normal ways of doing things, and being prepared to learn from both success and failure. And the idea being then to take the learning from that to help us to develop a strategy to support the foundational economy in Wales going forwards. So we had 52 projects looking at key themes around social care, food, procurement, town centre and housing, and looking at trialling different business models, whether that was cooperatives, micro firm models of social care, for example, the use of technology, a major focus on attracting new talent and skills, and looking at ways to look at business growth and supporting what's very often referred to as the missing middle and the development of SMEs in Wales. And in terms of the learning of that, the experimental approach was actually very well received, but we did find that some of the mundane challenges really persisted. And one of the really kind of key themes that came out of that, which I'm sure people won't be surprised around, has been some of the challenges around public procurement and getting a change in behaviour and thinking away from buying the cheapest widget to a real understanding of social value. We also found that some of the novel experiments that I think the Foundational Economy Unit were very excited by were less well understood by some of the policy areas. And so some of those are actually areas that we want to revisit and challenge again going forward. And another one was around a mechanism needed to spread good practice and a real keenness to get away from pockets of good practice into a really kind of Wales-wide approach. So alongside that, then last year we had the Backing Local Firms Fund, which was a firm that was looking at helping Welsh businesses overcome barriers. And again, we had sort of a limited number of key areas of focus around food, optimised retrofit programmes, so the decarbonisation of housing, and social care, with a kind of particular focus on some of the recruitment and retention challenges in the social care space, and a real need to drive up the working conditions of people working in social care space. So ideas for that were developed with policy leads, but also with industry and wider stakeholders. And we're expecting to see the outputs and learning from that through April and May. And again, we'll be using that very much to kind of underpin the development of the detail of the strategy going forward. Alongside this, we've been working with CLES that Sarah referred to earlier. So CLES have been delivering for us a progressive procurement programme with our public service board clusters, and that's very much been looking at how we can embed community wealth building principles into procurement locally to help them deliver their local wellbeing objectives. So we're seeing the kind of the reports coming out of there now and the learning from that. And CLES are also, based on that, developing training resources for us, drawing on the experience of that programme, And what we want to do is promote that learning across the whole of the Welsh public sector. And again, looking at how can we develop the capability to embed community wealth building into decision making, and moving away from the traditional reliance on lowest cost that people really seem to fall back to. So future FE strategy. One of the, as I said earlier, we're a small team, and I was very conscious that the scope of foundational economy, sort of general estimates are in Wales, it looks at 40% of the economy of Wales in terms of employment, and 1 in every £3 that is spent. And in some areas of Wales, depending on the makeup, it can be as much as 75 to 80% of the economy it would be considered within foundational economy. And it's a very cross-cutting area, touching across multiple portfolio areas in government. So very conscious of the risk of setting undeliverable expectations and spreading ourselves too thinly to try and do too much, at the risk of not delivering anything in terms of tangible benefits. So we presented a proposal to ministers to focus on a small number of agreed priority sectors. I mean, that's for 22-23, but that is as part of a wider 3-year strategy trying to develop, because you know, absolutely accepting some of the challenges around short-term funding for innovative projects, we want to look at developing a longer-term strategy that will really help to drive change. So within that, we're looking at food, not just public centre contracts and the potential that might be offered by the provision and the introduction of free school meals in Wales, but also working with colleagues across government to look at opportunities, working with retail and major supermarkets to get more local products on shelves, and working with colleagues looking at farming and food supply chains linked to the net zero strategy, and how we can maximise the benefit to the foundational economy within that. Health and social care, we have got Wales Co-op developing recommendations for a strategy of how we can grow the role of not-for-profit organisations in this space. And then with health, we're looking at that really alongside the wider public procurement space, and also how some of the capital development projects in train in Wales around build of large new hospitals can be maximised to deliver local benefits through the foundational economy. Decarbonisation, we're looking at, is an area, because there is such a large amount of investment coming down the line here in terms of the decarbonisation of homes, the planned decarbonisation of the bus fleet in Wales in particular, and really working there to look at how we can identify opportunities for foundational economy businesses in that space, including understanding future pipelines and how we can then support those businesses to develop capability to really maximise the benefit from that. And then I've touched on public procurement, which is absolutely cross-cutting, very much links to the procurement pillar of community wealth building, and the real challenges of engaging with public sector to challenge some of the thinking around cheapest widgets versus wider social value, but also then supporting businesses to actually be able to effectively engage in public procurement. We will develop the Backing Local Firms Fund that I referenced earlier, and then really looking at developing a key role for the team as a bridge between teams, departments and external partners. Foundational economy is so cross-cutting that it can't be delivered by a small single unit in Welsh Government. It needs to be right across government. So we have a role to work with all of those different departments, ensuring that they're embedding FE principles within their policy and delivery plans. This is really recognised by ministers, which is why foundational economy features regularly on the programme for Government Cabinet Subcommittee, because it's recognised this needs cross-government oversight really to make a difference, and reflecting that the level of priority ministers put on this might not necessarily be reflected right across departments in Welsh Government. So that's giving us a real opportunity to really kind of move the foundational economy right up the agenda and challenge other government departments to be considering that. And as part of that, we're going to be doing FE enablement reviews, so effectively independent deep dives into government departments across Wales to look in a collaborative and constructive way about how they are supporting the foundational economy through their work, so we can spread some of the good practice from that, but also look at how they can develop things further and work more closely. And we'll be kind of really looking at the governance point to make sure we've properly got that cross-government piece in place. Very briefly then, I'm very keen to get us into a real data and evidence based approach. So looking at developing robust data and intelligence around all the different sectors of the foundational economy. That'll help us inform making decisions around priority actions and areas for investment, but also keen to look at indicators of progress and how we can enable benefits measurement to get a really key really clear idea of which interventions are working and where we need to look potentially differently at how we're trying to support the foundational economy. And then finally, but really importantly, collaboration with and learning from other administrations. So very conscious that there are other areas and other administrations that are doing things better than us. We have particular challenges, for example, around use of land and property. So we're really keen to work with other colleagues to look at how we can kind of spread and share that learning and develop things further in Wales. So that's it. Hopefully I've stopped sharing now.
You have indeed, yes.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Anya. Yeah, a lot to consider there. And clearly there's a legislative agenda which is way ahead of where we are locally. And perhaps to speak to that, among other things, is our final speaker in this session, Brendan Murtagh, Professor of Urban Planning at Queen's University Belfast. He also leads the social economy strand of Queen's Communities and Place initiative, which is designed to support local economic development and social enterprises across Northern Ireland. And as we heard earlier, he is on the new ministerial panel looking at community wealth building in Northern Ireland, and that's what he's going to talk to us about today. Brendan, thank you. Brendan, you're sharing your screen, but I don't know if you're talking to us because we can't hear anything at the moment. So you may be muted.
That's a rookie error for a lecture. Now you
there
know
you
how
are
the students feel. Thanks, John, and thanks, Charlie, for the invite. What I wanted to do very quickly was reflect on some of the research that DTNI and Trademark had carried out with development trusts across Northern Ireland, and in particular, the seminars that they carried out sectorally, the focus groups on an area basis, and some quite detailed questionnaire surveys with albeit a limited number of development trusts, but that is a data set that's growing. And to give some preliminary feedback on what the sector thinks, what their priorities are, what their experiences have been, and then to reflect a wee bit more on the pillars of community wealth as a framework for understanding how all of this, the ideas of an inclusive and shared economy, move forward. One of the points that was made by the sector is that a lot of this is not new, and there is a very powerful social enterprise development trust, call it what you will, social economy across the region. In fact, for many areas, asset-based social enterprises providing multiple services are often the only economy that's operating in anything like a sustainable way. They're big, they operate with high levels of income, and they hold quite significant assets. And when you look, and again, it is quite a limited survey, at the financial profile of many of these development trusts, they are often the key driver of economic development and service provision right across a mix of areas, whether it's rural communities, small towns, housing estates, or in big inner city areas. The way in which capital flight and the type of problems that Hard was talking about that we see with inner cities, it's often the only replacement economy that we see as sustaining anything like jobs, incomes, service provisions. And critically, and some of the work that we've been looking at with CLES, recycle money within those neighbourhoods in effective ways. The penetration of these organisations into some of the most disadvantaged areas are quite profound. Most operate in the most deprived areas, both in terms of their number, but also in terms of their asset base. And the asset value of development trust in this context and their ability to sustain an alternative economy is quite significant. I suppose much of the feedback from the sector is about the nature of community wealth building, our understanding of it, and how it can be brought together as a useful framing device for policy, for interventions, and for financial support. From a sector's point of view, I suppose there are a number of issues around each of these themes, and it's encouraging to see them both as themes, but also as integrative elements that can help build the type of enabling environment that others have talked about from other countries and sectors. There is a critical need to build backbone organizations. Not everyone needs to be a high capacity social enterprise, but in each of these areas, there are organizations in communities that are capable of themselves acting as a catalyst for regeneration. They need to be scaled. They need money, free money, grants, but also debt. There is an appetite for, and one of the things we looked at was the use of loan finance. Probably not as much as in other areas, not as much as the capital base would suggest a lot of organizations might borrow, but that then raises all sorts of ethical compromises and contradictions for organizations that do want to scale and do want to get into some of these areas. We need to make better use of financial levers. Talked about credit unions and the way in which in the Republic they have been deregulated to lend to housing associations. That's a model that many are encouraging. The proposals for a mutual bank, again, are all about diversifying the supply and bespoke finance that will help anchor a community wealth building agenda in some of our most disadvantaged areas. But we also need policies and programs to help kickstart, scale up, and incubate some of these alternative economic models. It was interesting to hear the Minister and the Department talk about a fair grant policy where proper living wage are now being protected in terms of the way in which DFC funds its programs. But the whole idea of strengthening access to work, developing job security and the labour market within the sector itself, and giving people a fair chance of getting into higher quality jobs with better wages and better returns, again, is something those in that sector wanted to see. It's not just, and again, part of the challenge here is the image of the sector as being in sort of dead end parts of the economy or low value labour markets is one that is constantly challenged. Procurement was raised, of course. We don't have a Social Value Act. There's some interesting initiatives around procurement, but that idea of building investment and contract readiness, scaling up the sector to be able to take advantage of procurement is of course a critical part of the problem. It's not just good procurement practice, it's the capacity of organizations out there to engage in that procurement market. And we don't have a lot of the regulatory advantages that they have across the water. We don't have asset transfer, we don't have asset transfer policy and right legislation and right to buy and right to challenge. We don't have general disposal consent. Many of the instruments that enable, they don't in themselves provide the solution, but enable us to build a community wealth building agenda simply don't exist here. And that's, again, something I know that the sector has been campaigning long and hard on. But coming back to some of the points about the structure of the sector and its presence, and this is, again, albeit from a development trust point of view, it is active in vulnerable sectors. It deals with some of the most marginalized and otherized people, and it works in some of the most disadvantaged places. Often when the private and the public market have left them, it is dealing with employment, enterprise, startup, economic pathways out of poverty, again, often in the absence of other interventions. And the idea that it is focused on low value sectors, especially in the social enterprise sector, is a challenge. But it's not to say that the economic value isn't there. The Social Enterprise Northern Ireland showed that there are 900 social enterprises in Northern Ireland, turnover of over $1 billion, gross value added of 625 million. This is not a marginal economic sector. It's not just rooted in dead end employment or low value sectors of the economy, but has capital power, it has presence and anchorage in some of the most disadvantaged communities, and it has been showing to build wealth and to recycle that around really disadvantaged areas. Groups want to see better access both to grant and debt finance to start up and develop. We tend to have lumpy funding programs here that often don't take groups through the development cycle. A lot do have an appetite for debt, both to sustain their enterprise, but also to scale up what it is they do. And we have seen good practices in fair funding, new procurement policies, building in 10% initially, social value into government contracts, and initiatives like Buy Social that are trying to broker social enterprises and development trusts into the procurement market is one that's certainly growing. The priorities for some of the groups are, we want to see legislation. We need that sort of legislation around social value and around asset transfer that have simply given competitive advantage to other areas. A social rights act, a social value act, and the type of asset transfer instruments that we see in other places have helped to give some sort of advantage to a community wealth building economy, and particularly the most disadvantaged communities. We also need direct funding to back up some of these things. There's a real concern that even instruments like community asset transfer simply are transferring a liability with no real capital program investment to make sure that it doesn't remain like that. Our funding, as I said, was lumpy. Groups were complaining they can get bits and pieces of maybe capital funding, but not necessarily the whole amount or the revenue that is absolutely critical to sustain these things. And there are, of course, skills and capacity building challenges, especially around finance, sustainability, the whole idea of investment readiness. And as I said, for the groups that are active in the procurement space and who do want to take on contracts, it's often their scale, the bundling of contracts, and their ability to negotiate those environments that are still barriers in the way. So just some conclusions and implications. It is encouraging to see those models and to hear other speakers talk about not so much the individual projects or groups, but the need to build the enabling environment. And this example from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently talked about the need for a complex, more integrated enabling environment that is about legislation. It's about programs and funding policies. It's about building the social finance market. If we're talking about making money work and just economies, we need the money and the finance to support it. Better brokerage and intermediaries to support skills. And generally, if we are talking about a community wealth building agenda, it is about building on the strengths and enormous capacities that are out there, the track record of success, but taking it to the next level by supporting the groups that are actually delivering it in practice. Thank you, John.
Brendan, thank you very much indeed. It's a really useful evidence base on which we can premise some of our discussions now, because Sarah, Aine and Brendan will take questions for about the next half hour or so. And I know there's lots in the chat, which I will scroll through in a moment. First, something just struck me from both Aine and Sarah. When we talk about business models and models of ownership, Aine, you were saying, there was that experiment looking at different business models, co-ops, for example. I was just wondering how that went in terms of the work you've done. And then also, Sarah, when you were talking about in both the Sheffield City region and Greater Manchester, the ownership hub, what exactly it's doing and how that work is panning out.
Yeah, I mean, so on the different kind of business models, I mean, the main work on this has been the experiments were in the kind of social care space, and the models that were developed, particularly around micro care models of delivery of social care in North Wales, have been very, very successful in terms of reducing sort of waiting list for carers, improving the working conditions for carers involved with it. So it's definitely areas that we're looking at continuing support going forward, and that will be supported by the Wales Co-op work and the strategy that we're expecting to arrive next month. It hasn't been without challenges though. This is, I think, one of the areas where other policy areas don't necessarily understand the benefits in the same way that we do. So I think there's going to be a bit of a challenge for us to do to look at how getting other policy areas to consider more innovative solutions as opposed to more kind of traditional responses to the recruitment crisis within social care.
Yeah, and just on the question about the ownership hub. So in Sheffield City region, they have got the ownership hub, which is basically a project which brings together cooperatives UK and the Sheffield City region, which is headed up by the Mayor Dan Jarvis, and the Employee Ownership Association. And the objective of the ownership hub is to really increase the number of employee-owned and worker-owned organisations in the city region, and it kind of acts like a sort of as what you might call, it tries to disrupt the usual business support model where businesses come, get support, and then go off and set up a traditional company or a sort of SME. And instead tries to encourage people to think about establishing their own employee-owned or worker-owned organisation in the region. And it also works with existing companies who may be wanting to consider how they, maybe an older company and the owner wants to retire, and looks at, well, how could worker or employee ownership be part of that conversation as well. So that's what's happening in Sheffield City region. And then in Greater Manchester, they've developed the Community Wealth Building Hub, which again is a similar initiative, which is trying to create a different pathway for economic ownership in the city region. And again, trying to disrupt the idea that the only way we can grow our economy is through kind of traditional types of businesses, and encouraging and providing support to people to set up cooperatives, social enterprise, worker employee owned companies. And in Greater Manchester, it's still at an early stage, but it was one of the key recommendations from the Inequalities Commission, which was a really far-reaching report. And actually, Neil McEnroy sat on the Inequalities Commission, and it set out a series of objectives to really get to grips with the inequalities, which are really quite serious in a city region like GM. And one of them was about a community wealth building hub. So that's what's happening there. So really about how do you diversify ownership and create new pathways by which people can connect to and have a stake in the economy longer term, and hopefully get some of the benefits.
Brendan, is there much happening locally in terms of this area, in terms of looking at different models of ownership and trying to encourage those?
Yes, there's an emerging landscape. We tend to have focused very much on social enterprises, companies limited by guarantee, but now there is an appetite for looking at other forms of ownership of land and property. Certainly some of the statutory sector providers are interested in looking at other ways of using the estate in a more diverse ways. There are, again, constraints around what can be disposed of and how it can be managed. And that sort of legislative or permissive environment, I think, would lead to a lot more innovation in terms of how we think about the diversity of ownership, the skill base of the people who were given the assets to, for example, and the capacity of groups to take this on. But with that, with skills and with money, there would be significant, I think, diversity in the way in which we think about community ownership, particularly of assets, land and buildings.
That does lead me on to my next question, which is just how important is the legislation to actually unlock a lot of this stuff? And I suppose that Sarah and Aine could speak to that as well in terms of their experiences.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that we are grappling with in Wales, actually, because we're doing a piece of work looking at the potential application of Macora law, which was first introduced in Italy to increase worker ownership, and we're looking at how you could use that as an inspiration to think about legislation in the Welsh government to increase the number of employee-owned companies within the next term of the Parliament. And we've had this debate about, what difference does legislation make to some of these agendas? And I think we've come to the conclusion that actually legislation can be really powerful in trying to provide rocket boosters to the agenda, rather than it being seen as a bit of something that you just add on, or a bit of an extra initiative that you introduce, that it actually got status and authority within the law, and we think that really does make a difference. So particularly when you're trying to kind of build a different type of economy. So I think we feel that it is important. Having said that, there is a lot, of course, that can be done alongside legislation, and legislation in itself isn't enough. And the point raised in the chat about finance, I think, is really critical, and that's been something that's come up hugely in the conversations we've been having about employee ownership in Wales. And I know in GM it's been a big topic of conversation with the Community Wealth Building Hub, and in fact thinking about how they could use the combined heft of organisations already within GM to provide seed funding and finance through and including existing public sector spend as well. So I think legislation is really important if we're to give this, a real sense of authority and credibility going forward.
Anya, and I suppose in Wales you have the legislation now. When it's there, it's doing what it's supposed to do, I assume.
Well, I mean, the Wellbeing Future Generations Act absolutely underpins everything, and I think what and the conversations that we've had with Sarah about what we're keen to see is what else can be done alongside that legislation, and is additional legislation necessarily the answer? But I mean, yes, the Wellbeing Future Generations Act really does kind of underpin all of this work, but the conversation is ongoing around whether more specific legislation is required, alongside the existing programme for government commitments that we've got in Wales around supporting cooperative and development of sort of different models of ownership. So yeah, I mean, I think the position is we've got some very, very good and effective legislation now, but we're continuing to have conversations with key partners about what might be needed going forward.
And I suppose the fact is, you are a civil servant there, you now have a legislative underpinning for what you are doing, and I suppose from a civil service point of view, that is absolutely key, that it's legislatively underpinned, because otherwise it's frankly not likely to get done or get taken necessarily very seriously.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really critical when we're engaging with organisations and trying to change fundamental behaviours in the way that public procurement is a really good example, to be able to point to legislation and responsibilities on public bodies to be delivering these wellbeing goals is critical in terms of making progress.
Yeah, Brendan, I suppose it's been talked about a lot, but the issue, even for example, of asset transfer is really quite difficult without a proper legislative underpinning. People feel there's a lot of risk there otherwise.
Yeah, and it goes back to your last point, Anya, there, that it makes it very difficult for asset holders to dispose of things where they think that the legislative permission to do it is fuzzy or risky. So it's giving certainty to the market on its own, as I think people, particularly development trusts, understand. It's not some sort of magic bullet. It's just part of the kit, part of the enabling environment to allow a community wealth building agenda to just be sustained more effectively. Without it, it is very difficult. In the Republic, they're looking at deregulating credit unions further. They're looking at a new model of social enterprise, a new legal form of social enterprise, like they have in Emilia-Romagna and the Basque Country. And these things on their own just give a sense around which more diversity can come into the sector, more certainty can come in terms of investment for those who have that need, and it gives those providing, particularly in government, more certainty about the decisions that they take. So of course on its own it's not going to be the solution, but it is absolutely critical if we're serious about a community wealth building agenda to address to some of these basic legislations that have been shown, particularly in Scotland, Wales and England, to have worked quite effectively.
So there's a good question here from Susan Russum, which we sort of alluded to earlier. How can we use AHEM, she says, levelling up funds as a driver for community wealth building? So, I just wonder in the sector how seriously or cynically the levelling up agenda is viewed at the moment.
I think.
Sorry, Brendan.
I think locally it's a source of funding. It's new, and I think, regardless of the rhetoric of levelling up, which I think is incredibly thin, certainly in terms of its ability to deliver genuine levelling up and the structural imbalances that we see regionally, even within Northern Ireland, levelling up between the region is deeply problematic. I think it's a source of money, it's a source of funding. If it's not associated with other bundles of funds, if it's not really going to bring together the necessary financial package to sustain things, projects, social enterprises, labour market schemes, then it will be limited. But I think there's genuine innovation and interest out there. There's been some successful schemes, some very good development trusts and social enterprises have benefited from it, and I've no doubt that the sector out there is very keen to work with local government, central government to put projects across the line.
I'm just going to come in there briefly. Just, I mean, yeah, I'm pretty cynical about the Levelling Up agenda, to be honest with you. I'm not really sure that it's that it's got sufficient resources behind it, if any, and I think it lacks. It was striking yesterday in the spring statement that the Chancellor hardly referred to levelling up at all, which makes me think that this isn't seen as an economic project, and that concerns me, because fundamentally it needs to be. If it doesn't have the heft of treasury behind it, then frankly it's not going to get very far. So I think I do agree with Brendan, though, that there's definitely scope to look at what funding is coming in to communities and organisations, and think about how you can make sure that we're squeezing as much social value from those funds to really deliver benefits and outcomes for people across Northern Ireland. I just wanted to also pick up the point from Bernadette about wealth too, and I think one of the real issues we have in the way that we think about and talk about economy across the UK is that we are too wedded to the idea that wealth is about money and about sort of.
Let me just read that comment
assets,
actually, because it's as you would expect a very insightful comment, which says a conversation limited to workers directly generating income is a weakness in the discussion. Sustainable communities are often sustainable through contributions of those described as economically inactive. All wealth is not money. What are the panel's views on this? And you were saying, Sarah, you were just picking up on that point.
Yeah, I think it's something that we've been thinking a lot about in our work, and particularly in relation to that question about community asset transfer, that often that conversation is about, well, how much return does it give to a council or to an organisation if we transfer this asset? And it's quite a narrow conversation, instead of thinking about the wider value of assets and of economy to people and place. And we all know that what you might call the core economy, if you like, the informal care that people provide to each other every day of the week, that's hugely, that is what keeps the economy actually working. And I think that we vastly underestimate the importance of that in our economic model at the current time. And I think community wealth building should be a way to try and recapture some of that and to give it its true value.
It's a fair point, and partly because we don't measure it, and because we don't measure it, it's then not valued in a monetized sense. And there's no doubt community wealth building and its various pillars get us into economic models, businesses, money, loan finance, which for many communities takes it away from the very DNA of good community practice. And there is inevitably, the more we get into this area and we're talking about growth and development and assets, and use language of the economy to think about communities and places and how they feel about themselves and where they want to go, all sorts of ethical compromises will come out here for social enterprises and for communities, and we've seen that in projects in different places, and that's something I think we need to be aware of in the community wealth agenda. It's not a costless development process at all, particularly for the sort of issues that Bernadette's raising here.
Yeah, and I suppose that phrase economically inactive, which is a very familiar phrase when you're reporting on labour markets. That at a stroke effectively excludes people who are retired, who are in education, who are home makers and carers. And I suppose it's just that that particular phrase has those kind of unfortunate connotations, assuming people are doing nothing, where in fact they are, as you say, very often community glue. And it goes back as you, I suppose, reflected on there, the issue of what gets measured and what doesn't, and what gets measured is often seen as being more important. But just to then jump to the issue of finance, I suppose, it's a comment from Nick O'Shealy, which I think is interesting, and one which I wanted to raise, which is, it says, can we highlight the importance of providing access to capital finance to enable community organisations to own and generate long-term sustainable income to fulfil their mission. Such access to finance will release huge energy and enterprise from community-based organisations. Please highlight this as a key issue or theme in the conversation. And there is this issue of, where is the capital finance coming from? And we've seen it alluded to in the chat here as well about the issue of community banking as well. So maybe if I could ask Aine, because I know there is some work, and again, she was into this in the chat, around community banking in Wales. What exactly is going on there, and what's the aim of the game there?
Yeah, so what the Bank Cambria is the development of the community bank in Wales. So very much looking at that kind of community-owned local branches for a community bank, and it's being developed alongside the work of the Development Bank of Wales. So the idea is for it to be kind of complementary alongside that. But it is, I mean, it's in relatively early days in terms of the progress, like, linking with the Monmouthshire Building Society about how they take that forward. But it is seen to be a real priority. It's not an area that is being led through the Foundational Economy Unit. It's being led alongside the team who manage the relationship with the Development Bank Wales. So I wouldn't want to speak about it with any kind of high level of authority, but I'm more than happy to, if people are interested in, also to put people in contact with the right people to have a more detailed conversation with.
Yeah, and these things they're not easy, because I know, for example, with the cooperatives, financial cooperatives in Northern Ireland, so we had the City of Derry Building Society, for example, which no longer exists because it was absorbed into what's the main local building society called? Excuse me for forgetting. Progressive. Just the issue there is, with any financial institutions now, there is a huge amount of regulatory requirements in terms of IT systems and so forth, and so it is actually quite difficult to get those sorts of organisations off the ground and kind of meet the regulatory requirements. Which I wonder if any of the panelists want to speak to that.
Yeah, there is an interesting proposal for a mutual bank here, and I think all of these things need to be looked at, especially to diversify the supply. And we don't have a lot of the social finance supply that we have in other regions. One thing I would point to, though, is the credit union sector here, which is worth billions. It's got penetration 60% into the population. I think in Wales it's in under 5%. So you can see that we have the financial power. If we're talking about community wealth building and financial power, we already have much of that asset base in the financial infrastructure we have. And I think it's an interesting point you were talking about there, John. There is a heritage here around community-based finance. And I suppose this raises the issue then about the legislation and the regulation of these financial institutions. Credit unions are incredibly well capitalized. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of quite sophisticated distribution network. They're right across communities in Northern Ireland, but they can't lend to social enterprises. As I said, there was an experimental initiative ongoing at the moment in the Republic to allow them to lend to housing associations. That would require regulatory change at Westminster. At London, it's not a devolved matter, but it's something people could get around the table to advocate for. I know it's something the credit union movement here want. Not everyone can borrow, but it is something that they can develop, and to look at these other sources of supply like mutual banks and where they would fit into the financial architecture that we have.
Yeah, and actually there was another question of financing from Susan again, which was whatever happened to social impact bonds? Are they still a thing?
They weren't well used here. Again, it wasn't something that a lot of public sector organisations tended to use to deliver services here, and again, at a bit of a patchy experience in Britain. We do have community shares and community bonds, and they have lifted quite significantly, which again goes back to this point about communities putting their hand in their pocket to finance their own development, and that has worked in a lot of areas. Again, it's not the monetized community or community effort, but many of these social enterprises have started from community bonds and community shares and have sustained it on that basis. But it's not a product that has been well used here, some say, thankfully.
There is quite a lot of energy at the minute around the sort of movement around CDFIs, sort of community development finance initiatives on the mainland. I know a number of local authorities certainly are looking at how they can invest their own money in local finance schemes which invest in local organisations, so that to provide, kind of fill some of that gap in terms of capital and revenue finance. So I know that is something that a lot of local authorities on the mainland are exploring at the minute. So that there might be some relevance from that conversation.
Just on that question of finance, if Martin Fisher from the ICLU is the Irish League of Credit Unions is still with us, it might be useful to hear from him about what is actually happening in terms of credit unions and the role that they can play here. Are you with us?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I've made that rookie mistake as well with the mute button here. So there's 2 mute buttons. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to DTNI and all the speakers this afternoon. I suppose just to come back on some of the points that been made there. Yeah, the credit union penetration in GB is around 2%. In Northern Ireland, it's 38%, and on the island of Ireland, it's in the high 60s. So there's one of the highest penetration rates in the world for credit unions here. I suppose on the Bank Cambria front, they've obviously experienced those regulatory and compliance difficulties which you spoke about, John, in terms of the difficulties of maintaining them. So they've now taken the decision to link in with an already existing approved building society. And Aine spoke about the Mormonth Building Society. And to Brendan's point there, just to clarify, credit unions can now lend to social enterprises and SMEs, and a lot of you may have seen the BBC programme there just before Christmas. I think it might have been Halloween time, where we were lending to borrowers, called the Borrowers, and we were lending to businesses in Ballymena and in Warren Point. But we're working with our credit unions, and we're working with social enterprise ANI and the Department of Economy to try and upskill and train our credit unions, as it's a much more complex lending to try and analyse business accounts and things like that. And we want to try and upskill our volunteers in that reserve. I've put a link in the chat there, John, just to highlight that we have a recently launched policy manifesto, which we would appreciate the time for everyone to try and have a look through. And we believe we've been around for 60 years, and we want to be around for another 60 years. We want to make credit unions fit for purpose. As has been mentioned there by Brendan, the ability of credit unions now in the south of Ireland to invest in social housing. There's now 3 vehicles set up which are pulling up to 800 million in investment, and it's likely that that's going to finance over 4,000 homes in Northern Ireland. We conservative estimate that we could have about 100 million available to invest in social housing, and we've been working with the Department for Communities to try and work as part of their draft housing supply strategy, and they now reference the fact that credit union financing could be an option in that regard. So we're hopeful that we are part of the community. We believe we're an anchor institution in Northern Ireland, and we want to continue to be part of the conversation in this area.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Karen Arbuckle was looking to come in there, I think, if she's still on.
Yeah.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. I'm not sure if I picked Brendan Murtagh up quite right. I'm not sure what the reluctance is or the aversion is against community share offers. Any of the community share offers in Northern Ireland have been extremely successful and have raised significant amounts of money, and all those businesses are successfully in operation. The critical thing here is, I've noted the comments where risk is mentioned. Co-ops and community benefit societies are no riskier than any other business, because we have to abide by the same rules and laws as any other enterprise. At the end of the day, we are a business that have to make profits. the critical difference is how we administer those profits, because we each have a share in the business and have a say in how it is owned, run and managed. And that's the bit that is continually missed. I'm a member of one of the biggest co-ops in Northern Ireland, which is Dale Farm. That has been running for donkey's years. The most recent ones that I'm involved with are in the energy sector, but there's breweries, food, care sector, you know, a lot of them have been mentioned today in the course of the presentations. And I think we have to get away from this aspect that there's some form of risk. Where is the evidence that that's the case?
Sorry, Karen, just on the issue of community shares, no, the opposite, but the community share offers that are out there have been highly impactful and give different users, including communities, a stake in the development of a particular project or cooperative. It's, you know, a really active, successful and very stable form of finance. And it's as Martin's point about the credit unions, it's about using the mix of supply of finance that we have to meet the different needs of different organizations and what will help with that. And I agree, the survival rate of cooperatives are often significantly higher than they are of SMEs. So I would agree with you.
Yeah,
Just
I
on
think
the,
sorry, go ahead.
John.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just on that risk point, that I think you're absolutely, I totally agree with you. It's more the perception of risk. And I think that is one of the, particularly within mainstream thinking. And I think that's one of the big inertias that we need to disrupt through community wealth building. You know, this idea that just because you're trying to do something different in how you set up an organisation, that it comes with greater risk. I think that is one of the kind of the really big kind of myths and perception and inertias that we need to challenge to work on community wealth building. And I think stuff like legislation helps with that.
Absolutely, because if you take the example of energy, we were pushing in the energy strategy for a community energy policy in Northern Ireland, and our local government is more keen to support gas. And now we see the circumstances of gas, and with Putin, we should have been securing our energy supply years ago, and we've been lobbying for that for the last 10 years. And still, we've just got our energy policy. And what kind of action plan was it? You know, it's so frustrating, this whole thing.
Yeah,
communities could be able to deliver for themselves, and energy cost is one of the ones that is very simple for us to be able to do. And we have such natural resources in Northern Ireland. We shouldn't be importing energy from anywhere, and we don't need coal.
Yeah, and the point on co-ops is well taken and well made, and I know people are still talking about it in the chat. And if you look at some of the co-ops, particularly in the Basque country, and the point around Dale Farm is a similar one. Some of those Basque country co-ops are massive industrial operations, which you know are long sustained and are very large businesses, and so you know that there is this the perception of risk from co-ops is not necessarily what it should be. We're running a little short on time, so what I want to do before we start to wrap up is just to go around each of our three panelists again, just to get some closing observations from them. Maybe if I start with you, Brendan, and just in terms of where you think things can possibly go next after the election, because clearly there's a good chance that we will have a new minister in the department, you know, her having just set up the panel there, where you think things are going to be moving over the next few years.
Well, I suppose I have to see what the new arrangements are and how stable they are, but there clearly is a political and a policy appetite to do something around the community wealth building agenda, and the speakers that we've seen here today and the enthusiasm from the sector is quite significant. I suppose from a development trust point of view, from some of the community groups that DTNI and Trademark surveyed, it is around that enabling environment. The community wealth building framework is a very important one to hang a lot of different initiatives, whether it's around finance in the credit union sector or legislation on asset transfer, using things like levelling up or supporting cooperatives on social enterprises, different species of business. It is that enabling environment that would be really helpful to see politically emerge from whatever the new assembly and whatever the new minister brings into it. But this is a useful and important start, and very encouraging to see and hear the enthusiasm from the sector and from the stakeholders around the table as well.
Aine?
I think from our perspective, you know, from I think we're fortunate in Wales that there is such a strong Welsh Government commitment behind what we're trying to do in the foundational economy space and the sort of the community wealth building principles, and that is key to its success. I referred to it in my talk that, you know, the fact that we've got a ministerial cabinet subcommittee looking at this and going, right, how can we help? How can we really take this forward? That's absolutely critical to be able to make major changes to the level of ambition that we have in Wales, I think.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today. And finally, Sarah, if you just give us your observations.
Yeah, I think that leadership on community wealth building is absolutely critical, and whilst I think it's great that the Minister for Communities is behind this agenda, I think it needs to be across government. It needs to be a systemic appreciation for the failures of the current economic model, and a willingness to try and build something different, and that needs to be across the piece. So I think, you know, the election, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the election or who's going to be in charge of different departments, but in some ways it doesn't matter. Community wealth needs to cut right across, and I think that's kind of crucial, and not just, I think, at an executive level. I think sometimes there's too much, you know, we're waiting for the executive to act all the time, and I think councils, with the powers that they have, also need to get on board with this and look at a much more systemic approach to community wealth building, and thinking seriously about how they need to disrupt their economic model and their approach to economic development, so that we're actually starting to realise that dream that Ted Howard articulated so well. You know, imagine what Belfast would be like if it was generating you know, a better life for everyone in the city, and I think that's a real challenge ahead.
That's a great note to end on, and I want to hand back now to Charlie Fisher from Development Trusts NI to wrap up and talk about next steps. And Charlie, thank you very much for the invite to take part today. It's been a great event, very well cast, lots of interesting voices. So back to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks for your excellent facilitation as always. And because of your interest, we'll probably invite you back a third time. So if Ted Howard is intending to make it over to the Ireland and UK later in the year, we'd certainly look to see if we can get him in Belfast and continue the conversation there. Look, there are a number of particular things, I suppose, that we will be doing going forward. We certainly will be continuing this work with Trademark and with the support of the Department for Communities. The work we've undertaken to date, we will disseminate those reports and the recommendations. We will continue to lobby and be a persuader for community wealth building across local government and central government. We think there's still a big job of work to be done there. And obviously we'll continue to work in partnership with our members and others who are active in this space with us, campaigning for legislation, including the Rights Act and general disposal consent, you know, working on participatory budgeting, working with Martin and the Irish League and the Ulster Federation as potential investors, and also noting and engaging with the work of others on a mutual bank. You know, we're going to continue to engage the voluntary community sector to ensure that it has the capacity to engage in the conversation and be a delivery agent around whatever may emerge, and again engage with a wider set of civic stakeholders from arts, culture, sports and faith-based organisations and further afield. We will take forward a programme beginning in April, and part of that is we're looking at developing 2 community wealth building hubs. So it was heartening to hear from Sarah about the work in Newcastle and Manchester. We'll certainly be looking to tie in with that. Our initial thoughts on this are the Northwest and the Northeast. So we will come back to you on that one. And then I suppose in terms of leading the work, we'll be looking to organise, you know, best practice visits, you know, across the regions as well. The Ministerial Advisory Panel has its terms of reference and is, suppose, beginning to work through that now. We've got an evidence base to present to them, and anything else that we can bring to that, we look to bring to that as well, and to influence any further policy development in this space. Hopefully trying to connect with Aine and her colleagues and some colleagues in the Scottish executive as well, so we can have an inter-regional sort of assessment of what needs to be done. We've got a particular sort of focus in terms of wanting to work with local government, and some local government authorities are with us on this. CLES are doing some independent work with Belfast City Council. Antrim and Newton Abbey are re-engaging with ourselves, and we've been doing some specific work with Newry, Mourne and Down District Council, and we know there's further work to be done. So there's a lot of things, I suppose, that we will be taking forward. I mean, I'm heartened, I suppose, by like today's event was very useful in terms of framing, in terms of looking at this from the international perspective, the UK perspective, and the regional sort of interventions as well, but also, seeing who's in the room and the enthusiasm that people still have for this agenda here in the north of Ireland. And I mean, I sense like the frustrations, many of the activists who've been in this space for many years feel in terms of trying to take this agenda forward. But I suppose we have to keep focused, on the prize, what it is that we want, and just continue to, work together and move forward in that regard. So some of the emerging recommendations from the report thus far, this is as information more than anything else, and all of this stuff has been touched upon already. But legislation is needed, particularly around the issue of assets and making asset transfer or public land and buildings, fit for social purpose. So we'll continue to push on that. And general disposal consent, or a version of it, is required in Northern Ireland, and it needs to take account, I suppose, for the different architecture of local authority administration we have in Northern Ireland. It's not the same as England and Scotland. With regards to places, financial transactions capital is still an under-resourced financial tool that's at our disposal, and a social aspect to that would be certainly very, very welcome. And just picking up on Karen's comments and Susan's comments, yes, support for community shares, community bonds. I mean, we're in that space with you, and anything we can do to advance that, we'd be happy to. And again, with Martin from the Irish League and with the Federation, considering ways and means in which we can push for deregulation of current rules, which inhibit the credit unions as a community anchor organisations playing a critical role in this agenda. With respect to the economy, then, yeah, it's about experimenting, I suppose, with particular interventions in particular areas around social enterprise zones or community wealth building hubs. So we have proposals around some thematic community wealth building hubs, but we have also proposals around two area-based hubs, as I said, the northeast and northwest, and hopefully we can draw lessons from that that will inform the wider debate and maybe encourage other people into that space. And respective work, we'll be articulating the need to integrate social enterprises and existing intermediate labour market training schemes into the local labour market partnerships, which are now being taken forward by local government. We don't know the shape of that yet, but we see that as an opportunity. And then in terms of procurement, again, working to strengthen the investment and contract readiness of our sector. And then I think more critically, trying to find ways and means about building procurement anchor networks, making connections between development trusts or cooperatives or community enterprise who could perhaps work together to drive the agenda forward. So those are just some of the things that we have in the offing. I suppose for me, like, it helps us as an organization who are a network for community development trusts, to have the weight of our members behind us, but also to have the support of all our activists and all our actors from cooperatives, from credit unions to support this agenda. And on that basis, we'll be looking to continue to work in partnership to take the agenda forward. Can I just say that on behalf of the board of DTNI and our staff, I need to just record my thanks once again to Ted for his keynote address, to John, obviously, for his absolutely excellent facilitation of the conversation, and to our other contributors, to Sarah. And we look forward to continue to work with CLES. And Sarah, thank you. To Aine, we look forward to making a new friend of you, Aine, in Wales, and having you over here. And obviously to Brendan as well. So, and finally, I suppose to yourselves for sticking with the conversation from 1 to now 3:30 exactly. Well timed. Thank you all very much indeed.
Just to close there, thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you to everybody who played a role in organising today's event, to all the speakers, to all the panellists. I think one thing that we can take away from today, there is potentially a moment of opportunity here. There is opportunities to be grasped on the legislative side. There is clearly more political interest in what we've been talking about, and that is something which should hopefully help maintain the momentum. And hopefully the next time we're doing something like this, it will be in person. We can all sit down and have a cup of tea or coffee. I hopefully won't be sick. And I look forward to seeing you all at some point in the near future. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.